All right. So our next step is to talk about transport. So we're going through, again, these are various means that living organisms have of maintaining their internal environments and getting the nutrients and things that they need. So talked in our last section about nutrients. Now we'll start talking about how various materials get around and get through cells. So if we start with sort of the basics, when we talk about transport, we're talking about materials moving into a living organism and moving within it. And it involves sort of two steps. First up is materials need to get into the actual organism. That's called absorption, moving materials into a cell. And in order to get materials into a cell, they have to pass through the cell membrane. You know that's the outermost living barrier of all cells. Okay? And the cell membrane is important. It regulates which materials can get in, which cannot, which materials leave the cell, how they leave. And if you remember back, there's two types of transport through a membrane. There's passive transport, diffusion, osmosis. Means of transport, this could be a hard copy. Passive transport, when materials are just diffusing from high to low concentration, or water is diffusing, or active transport, which requires some energy. Okay? There's lots of types of active transport. Direct active transport, when ATP is directly used to bring molecules in. Pinocytosis, the pinching in of the membrane to sort of take in material. Phagocytosis, lobbing around and engulfing material. These are all means of active transport that sometimes are used to get large molecules into the cell or to move molecules across the concentration gradient from low to high concentration in a way they normally would not go. Once those materials are in the cell, then in the organism, they are moved around. They have to be transported from place to place. We call this circulation, okay? Transport of materials within the cells or throughout an organism. So within a single cell, we have intracellular transport, movement of molecules within a single cell. And that happens through diffusion. Molecules can just diffuse from one part of the cell to another through the cytoplasm. The cytoplasm itself actually moves around and kind of circulates within the cell. That's called cyclosis. The ER, the organelle we talked about, the endoplasmic reticulum, help transport material from one part of a cell to another. Microfibrils are tiny little strands of fiber which help in the movement of molecules. So all of those things are used to move things within a single cell. But in more complex organisms that are made of multiple cells, multicellular organisms, there are other means as well. And that's called intercellular, so transporting material between different cells. And this happens differently depending on the type of organism. Sometimes material can diffuse from one cell to another. Many organisms, complex organisms, have vascular tissues, like plants have xylem and phloem. Animals have blood vessels to transport things, lymph material. This is how things get transported from one cell to another. So we're going to talk about our different groups again, and it's going to be the same groups we talked about with nutrition, and then we'll talk about with all of our systems. So first, plants. Plants need to transport materials, and there's really two broad categories of plants. They're called tracheophytes and bryophytes. Bryophytes are very simple plants, things like mosses. They don't have any vascular tissue. They don't have any xylem or phloem. They can't transport water or materials from one part of the plant to another. So these include things like mosses. And what you'll notice is mosses don't grow very large because there's no means of moving water and other things up into a large stem. So they're generally pretty low-growing, compact plants. And basically, material in this moss just diffuses from one cell to another, and that's how material moves around in these bryophytes. The plants we're probably more familiar with are tracheophytes. These are more complex plants. They have vascular tissues. They have xylem and phloem for transporting material. And that includes, trees and flowering plants and grasses and so forth, and ants. And so vascular plants, the tracheophytes, they have roots, stems, and leaves as their main parts, and each of those has some function to do. Okay, the vascular tissue helps move things around in the plant. And we know the roots of a plant are involved in transport. Transport of what? Water. Okay, roots absorb water. Okay. And the roots are actually pretty large. We don't see them, so we often don't think of them this way, but often the roots of a plant, the below ground roots are just as large as the above ground portions of the plant. And roots have a lot of functions. They help anchor the plant in the ground. They often serve as a storage area for nutrients, for glucose. They absorb water from the soil. They absorb minerals and nutrients from the soil, and then conduct those nutrients and water into the stem of the plant. When you look at the roots of a plant, what you'll notice is there's very, very tiny root hairs attached to these roots that increase the surface area, allowing it to absorb as much water and nutrients as possible. Kind of like the villi in the small intestine. They increase the surface area, allowing for greater absorption of materials. Vascular plants have the xylem and phloem. Okay? The xylem, which transports water through the plant. The phloem, which transports sugar. Most of the water is moving upwards because it's absorbed in the roots and has to move to the other parts of the plant, so it's mostly an upward movement of water. And that process that brings it up is called transpiration. We talked about that before. And the phloem is for the movement of sugars and other materials. Mostly downward, but not always. Depends on the time of the year and so forth. We know sugars and glucose are made in the photosynthetic parts of the plant, in the leaves. And then they can be transported to the other parts of the plant that need those sugars. They can be stored in the roots and then come back up to the leaves in the spring as they grow. And so you can see, if you look at this picture of the leaf, this photo, you can see this is the vascular tissue. These are called the veins of a leaf. And what veins in a leaf are those vascular tissues. These are made of bundles of xylem and phloem to transport material both out to the leaf and into the plant from the leaf. So what you see in the veins of a leaf, those are the vascular bundles. Protists. Protists are unicellular. Okay? They're aquatic. They live in the water. So they absorb material basically just by diffusion. They absorb oxygen from the water they're living in into their cells. Once those materials are inside of the protist, then they can be circulated around by diffusion, cyclosis, ER, all those things we just talked about. But also we know that because they live in water, and usually fresh water, they're constantly taking in water due to osmosis, and so they have to eliminate some of that water. Otherwise they would swell up and burst. So they have contractile vacuoles which pump out that excess water. This is a paramecium up here. And this is a full contractile vacuole. These arms of the contractile vacuole have brought in excess water. Then the vacuole contracts and sort of pumps it out, and then it'll fill up again. And it happens regularly, constantly pumping out this water that's flowing into the protist. Finish up here with the Hydra. The Hydra, we know, is an aquatic invertebrate, an cnidarian. And again, it's very, very small. It's very thin. It has just 2 cells thick, the ectoderm and the endoderm. So it is able to absorb material through diffusion. Okay? Doesn't have any specialized vascular tissue. But inside on the endoderm, these cells have flagellum, which helps circulate material around, helps mix and sort of move things around within its body cavity. So that's how they accomplish their intercellular transport. Okay, don't forget, you guys have a couple pages of homework to do tomorrow.
That's special. 4 pages and notes.
What's that?
Can I just recycle these?
Just leave them up there. I'll print out a copy for you and give it to you.
We're 71 through 72 due today, or no?
Four pages of notes.
What's it due today?
And that's it.
What was due today?
Is there homework due today or is it due tomorrow?
Due Wednesday.
It says due Wednesday.
Yeah.
Spatio, why did you have to say something?
Well, I mean, because I got 57 on the quiz.
It's because
So I feel like I needed to be.